Now let's talk about the idea of the final straw. Relationships end for lots of reasons. These can include lack of communication, incompatibility, differences in financial styles, work styles, how you think about money, wrong place, wrong time, right person, wanting different things. And frankly, I view these as sort of the healthy reasons relationships might end. Personally, that what I think that they speak to fundamental difference that at this time in history, people can reflect on and say, no, whatever this is, it's not working for me, and continuing to keep this relationship on life support can lead the people in the relationship to stop growing together or even to stop growing altogether. And so sometimes the people in the relationship, based on some of these kinds of differences, end it. And some of them even stay friends, or at least they don't have long-term bad blood. Then I come back into my lane, and I think about narcissistic relationships. And the reasons that narcissistic relationships end can be quite different. For example, because the narcissistic person went to get new supply. Because you started to feel like you were experiencing symptoms of complex trauma. Because it's one of many breakups you have, and you just keep going between breakup and hoovering cycles, and it's an unhealthy breakup makeup cycle, and that's the only way that the relationship works. Now, all that other stuff I listed, the lack of communication and the financial stuff and all the other stuff, that stuff may have been happening. But in narcissistic relationships, that's actually often not why it ends. The ending of narcissistic relationships and all the associated confusion, but the ending is never smooth. And there is typically long-term bad blood and lots of icky stuff like rumination, sadness, self-blame, you know the drill. I was recently reading a scientific journal article about relationships, and they got to this idea in the article of final straws. The relationship was rolling along, but the person in the relationship that they were interviewing in the study said that they split up, that they ended the relationship, or that the reason the relationship ended was because the folks said they hit the final straw. And there were 3 very consistent final straws that the researchers found: substance and alcohol use, domestic violence, and or infidelity. When one of those came into the picture, that was often cited as what ended the relationship. Now, in many cases, these final straws were very likely happening alongside other really unhealthy relationship patterns. But final straws are tricky because final straws don't always happen in a relationship, and they don't always happen in narcissistic relationships. Narcissistic relationships are a confused mess. Trauma bonded, maybe there's something I can change in myself, maybe it's my fault, maybe it's not that bad, maybe they didn't mean it, they said they're going to therapy, lots of people seem to like them, maybe I can find a way to say it differently. Or just in general, these relationships are unsettling. Things like, if I leave, I am going to get eviscerated in the divorce. Or you may have a fear of a smear campaign or custody battles. Or most people you know doubting you or maybe even shutting you out. Ending a narcissistic relationship is not about a lack of compatibility. Sometimes these relationships don't get ended because we are just trying to survive. So that takes us back to those final straws. I have no doubt that many of you in narcissistic relationships might have made a final straw your hard line in the sand. I'm out of here if they cheat. If they don't stop drinking, or if they get a DUI, or if they ever lay hands on me, I'm out. Those are things you see, and they're things you can see. Those are things you may sometimes, hopefully, many times, be able to get support for. If people think you're married to an alcoholic or a cheater or a physical abuser, you probably are more likely to get support compared to someone who's citing emotional abuse, and even then, you're not always likely to get support. But if you say that you're being gaslighted or don't feel emotionally safe or that you're being chronically invalidated or minimized, you're more likely to face up to people who may say, well, it takes 2 to tango, etc., etc., or relationships are hard. You know the drill. Even those folks who do end these relationships on the basis of incompatibility or communication issues, they'll face some of that "why did you end your relationship" heat. The difference is that if they are not in a relationship with a narcissistic person, then they don't experience the same kind of destabilization that happens when you are in a narcissistic relationship. And even if people are critical of you leaving, you may feel you have more psychological safety as you decide to leave the relationship and aren't expending lots of bandwidth on how do I leave this without ruining my life. Now, these final straws are not a given in a narcissistic relationship. And while these final straws are not uncommon in narcissistic relationships, not all narcissistic relationships get there. And some folks wait. They wait for a final straw. In fact, it's sort of a dark future fake within yourself. Someday if I catch them cheating, I'm out. Or I'll get him on video throwing something at me and then I'm out. There is so much self-gaslighting that happens in these relationships that these final straw type things can even substantiate your sense that, see, they did that. I deserve to leave. I have the right to leave. Or simply, you'll say, this is real, see? So I can leave. And the drug and alcohol one is tricky in narcissistic relationships. There's a lot of overlap with a substantial chunk, in fact, some studies estimate almost half, of people living with addiction or problem substance or alcohol use also have antagonistic personality styles like narcissism. Again, a lot of overlap. And for a long time, you may think their general assholery is due to intoxication or just being an addict. But should they get sober, the assholery goes nowhere, and the behavior can get worse because now they no longer have drugs and alcohol regulating them at all times. So you may now deal with even more rage. But even then, for example, if their alcohol use, they were so disinhibited and impulsive it culminated in violence, or something that put you or your children in danger, like driving under the influence, that would be something more final straw-esque. And thinking about leaving and not doubting yourself about it may feel more accessible. I wouldn't argue that final straws always break the trauma bond. In some cases they may. A sort of breaking out of the dance of thinking, well, sometimes it isn't bad because you simply cannot unsee some of these final straw type of things. You can't unsee them happening. But many people remain in narcissistically abusive or other abusive relationships for reasons above and beyond just feeling that if they leave, that their lives are in danger. And those reasons are often related to the trauma-bonded patterns. I mean, the statistic is often circulated that on average, people in abusive relationships go back 7 times before finally leaving. The final straws, however, may result in other people giving more pointed advice in terms of giving you more support in therapists or other people around the situation, being more direct in what they believe you can do, or even in other advocacy resources being available to you. And listen, there are narcissistic relationships that do hit the final straw point, and that are not nearly as unhealthy and harmful as those relationships that don't hit the final straw point. The cumulative harms of psychological abuse in a relationship do not get adequately accounted for. In cases of coercive control, there may never be physical violence or drug and alcohol use or infidelity. But the people in those relationships are absolutely terrorized and imprisoned, even though the doors aren't literally locked, though sometimes they are. Remember, it's called a final straw for a reason, because there were lots of straws up to that point. And most of those other straws are not as clear cut and is often the day-to-day crap of the narcissistic relationship. Lots of bad relationship, like Lifetime movies and news stories and all the rest, are about these final straw relationships. I have almost never seen the one that doesn't go there, where there's not final straw stuff, but lots of little straws. And we have full empathy for the survivors in those final straw movies. But what we do not see is the day-to-day death by 1,000 cuts, the chipping away of a person through multiple daily indignities. Sadly, in our cultures, even in the most unhealthy and toxic of these, they may still be viewed as, well, that's marriage, or no relationship is always easy. Don't get me wrong. People in final straw relationships are definitely suffering, and many have been suffering for a long time. But for those of you in long-term narcissistic relationships who feel unheard and unseen and also confused because you haven't hit a final straw, or don't feel you have a good enough reason to consider maybe that this relationship isn't good for you, or you're gaslighting yourselves in the absence of that so-called last straw, sometimes they don't come. And I got to tell you, I've seen this repeatedly in my career. Even when they do, people in narcissistic relationships especially will future fake themselves and say, okay, yeah, I know, I'd say I'd leave if they cheated, but I just saw a text. Maybe it wasn't that bad. Or they said they'd go to therapy. Or they didn't throw that thing at me. They just threw it at the other side of the room. In narcissistic relationships, that damned camel has a really strong back. And one final straw rarely breaks it. Thanks again.